So the fighting in Pokrovsk is now house to house, as in Ukrainian drones moving through buildings, hunting down Russian infiltrators like this clip here from the 25th Airborne. Further north, near Dobropilya, Ukraine continues to retake territory and repel Russian attacks, destroying multiple armored vehicles in the process. However, when we step back, it's pretty clear that Pokrovsk is probably about to fall, and Putin is really seizing on this as his major propaganda win of the year. So much so that he's directing his military to enforce a ceasefire, local ceasefire, so that foreign journalists can enter the area to document the Ukrainian forces are truly surrounded. But here's the thing. They're not actually surrounded. That's just kind of the messaging that Putin is going with. Now, I wanted to start out here with a clip that just came out yesterday showing Russian soldiers surrendering to a Ukrainian drone in Pokrovsk. We don't see this a lot. It's not all that common. It's not all that feasible for drones to actually accept the surrender of soldiers on the battlefield, because what are you going to do? How are you going to get them to friendly lines? That's not always within reason. In this case, we see the Russian soldiers waving some sort of white flag outside the side of the building as the Ukrainian bomber is hitting that target. Again, 2 Russian soldiers, middle of Pokrovsk. Keep this in mind, 2 guys. They're not in a trench line. They're not in a heavily fortified position. I want you to keep this image in mind of 2 Russian soldiers in that small shed that was just hit again as we look here in a second at the maps of Pokrovsk to get an idea of what territorial control there looks like. Now, quick note, there is never a perfectly safe way to surrender on the battlefield. It's just not possible. I mean, in this case, they clearly have to walk towards Ukrainian lines and have to assume and hope that all Ukrainian units are on the same page and that no outpost is going to say, hey, there's 2 Russian soldiers on the street and mow them down, and hope that no Ukrainian drones that are overhead, that countless, dozens, hundreds maybe at a time, see those guys and decide to destroy the target. They did in this case, but that's just one of the many reasons why surrendering to drones isn't always a viable option. In this case, they also do not appear to have been targeted by Russian forces that we've seen happen multiple times as well. Russia firing on their own as they move back towards Russian lines after an assault, or when they try to clearly move towards Ukrainian lines to surrender. But in this case, in Pokrovsk, a lot of these guys, I mean, we've seen some cases where they've been pushed up into Pokrovsk with, a couple water bottles, and they're kind of on their own there for a week or longer before they're resupplied in any meaningful fashion by their own forces. So anyways, wanted to show that clip to give you a little bit of an idea of what's playing out in Pokrovsk. I'm going to shift over to a map here, a couple different maps that we're going to run through today. This is Deep State map. This is Suryak. And they show very different situations in Pokrovsk, and the key takeaway here is nobody knows. How about that? Can we just start with that? Nobody really knows. Look at Suryak map has Russian control all over southern Pokrovsk with some elements north of this rail line here in the middle. I'll zoom in a little bit further. So that's like all of Pokrovsk under Russian control. You move over to Deep State map, and it shows that there's some contested areas inside of Pokrovsk with none of that happening north of the rail line. And here's the thing. When you go back to that clip of the 2 Russian soldiers in the outpost right by the railroad, it looked like, so maybe up here near the north, how do you document that? Is that Russian control? I don't know that 2 guys in a building being hit by drones is necessarily territorial control over that space. So, look, I have seen Ukrainian maps that are much more pessimistic than this one, and I've seen Russian maps that are far more conservative than this one. So take your pick at this point. Nobody really knows the current situation of the forward line in Pokrovsk. Now, we do have a couple of different assessments here worth running through. One from Ukrainian General Syrskyi, where he says the enemy is increasing activity in the area of the Pokrovsk-Kaliningrad amalgamation, so here on the map. He says the situation is difficult, but the statements of Russian propaganda about the alleged blockade of the defense forces of Ukraine in Pokrovsk as well as Kupiansk do not correspond to reality. At the same time, in Pokrovsk, enemy infantry avoiding combat is accumulating in urban areas, changing locations, so the primary task is to detect and destroy it. Just like the couple different videos there, right? The hunting of the Russian soldiers through the buildings by the 25th Airborne we saw at the beginning. They are conducting drone strikes all day, every day, against 1, 2, 3 Russian soldiers at a time. And then, of course, the bomber mission at the beginning of today's video where the capture actually took place. He says the Dobropilya operation continues, and for that I'm going to zoom up a little north here. this area on the top of the map here, where the green and the blue is territory that has been cleared by Ukrainian forces. You can still see some pockets of Russian resistance near Kushcherev Yar and then to the west of Shakov. A lot of the armored assaults recently that we've seen by Russia have been in this area right here. But in talking about this overall Dobropilia direction, Syrskyi says, as of today, assault units have advanced from 200 to 550 meters in certain directions. In total, during this operation, 186 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory has been liberated and 247 square kilometers cleared of enemy sabotage and reconnaissance groups. Then turning over to, I'm going to use the Suryak map for this one, Rybar providing a bit of an assessment here. So Russian media, they start out talking about Minograd over here in the east, saying that troops entered the 8th Settlement Micro-District on the northeastern outskirts, wedged into the Ukrainian defense of the settlement. Simultaneously, battles are ongoing south of Mine 5-6, near where a Russian landing force previously successfully deployed. I'm going to play a couple more videos for you here, and we've got a handful of these in today's episode, where you're going to see the first clip is what Russia shared, saying that this was a successful landing or dropping off forces near Minograd. The clip cuts out, and it just seems like, all right, Russian armored vehicle, move forward, infantry dismounted, and that's that. Then we have this clip, this one released from the Ukrainian Marines, showing a bit of a different view, clearly the same location, could have been after that landing, or maybe it was the same one, just a little different timing, where they destroy the Russian landing group, definitely at least wound a couple of those soldiers and blow up the armored vehicle. So expect to see conflicting footage around Pokrovsk for quite a while now, at least in the next couple days and weeks. Turning back to Rybar, they say, in Pokrovsk, the situation for Ukrainian formations is close to critical. About half the city is already under stable Russian control. So the Rybar assessment links up more closely with the Suryak map here. They say a Russian flag was raised on the western outskirts. The enemy later destroyed the flag with an FPV drone. This indicates that the Ukrainian infantry no longer controls the territory in this sector. They also draw parallels with Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and Sudza. Escaping through the bottleneck after partial encirclement has repeatedly been a catastrophe for Ukraine. The worn-out mantra that people are more important than territories is being raised. This is a clear sign of the city's imminent surrender. So this is actually something that Putin keyed in on as well, saying that all of the forces in here are now surrounded as well up in Kupiansk. That's not the case. Even most reliable Russian mill bloggers at this point are the ones that tend to be pretty close to reality. Even they're not suggesting that Ukraine is surrounded here. The closest you can come to that is that this area to the northwest, the only real entrance and exit route, is pretty heavily saturated with Russian drones. We saw a clip in a video earlier this week from the 25th Airborne where they're having to park their vehicles 5, 10, 15 kilometers outside of this area and conduct dismounted movement to resupply troops and bring out the wounded. So it's very, very challenging, very deadly to get in and out of Pokrovsk right now. But the idea that these troops are all cut off and encircled is just not the case as of now. Now, turning to what this means big picture, analyst Clement Moline put out an interesting assessment here that I wanted to share, where he said that undoubtedly the capture of the Pokrovsk urban conglomerate will mark Russia's great victory of 2025, on par with the capture of Bakhmut in 2023 and the clearing of Donetsk's western suburbs in 2024. And a quick note here, when looking at Pokrovsk, I feel like we're so zoomed in, so dialed in to what's happening in this one area, we maybe lose sight of its overall significance in the conflict. Let's go over here to Deep State Map. This is Pokrovsk here, right? They're the focus of all this fighting, the focus of Russian offensive operations in 2025. They're getting ready to take it, would be my guess. I would expect that it will be fully under Russian control by the end of the year. That is the trend that we're on. The pre-war population of Pokrovsk was 60,000. That made it the 72nd largest city, largest by population in Ukraine before the war. 72nd largest. This is not some major hub in Ukraine. This is very similar. What comes to mind, and this is oversimplifying it, I get it, but what comes to mind are some of the major battles on the Western Front in World War I, where they were areas that weren't all that significant, but they became significant because that's where the two forces met, if that makes sense. If Russia is planning a large-scale invasion of Ukraine, Pokrovsk might not even show up on that map. All right, this is not some strategic hub. It has become more important as the two sides have fought fiercely, no doubt. Thousands, tens of thousands maybe have lost their lives in this area, countless equipment destroyed and lost. Like, it's been significant. But if we zoom out, I'm going to do that here on Deep State Map to give you an idea of how small this area actually is in the grand scheme of things. We don't even have, there we go. Now we have all of Ukraine in the map. You can barely pick out Pokrovsk right here. Now, the reason I wanted to point that out is Clement Moline continued on here with some interesting graphics that I'll have linked in the description below, saying what is certain is that this time the Ukrainian army has prepared for what comes next, with 3 defensive lines and 2 under construction along the road to Pavlograd. And he marks a lot of Ukrainian defensive positions further west. Look, no doubt, losing defensive positions generally makes it harder to mount an effective defense, right? Every time you have to fall back, technically, there's going to be some challenges with that. They might not be as well prepared. You're ceding territory to enemy forces. But one of the major challenges we saw in a few areas early in the war was some of these areas would fall, like Bakhmut a little bit, Avdiivka more so, and Russia would pretty quickly be able to jump another 10, 15, 20 kilometers into kind of open space where Ukraine had not yet set up viable secondary and tertiary lines. According to Clement Moline, who's been tracking a lot of these, the Donbass line, as he's referred to it, I believe, there are a lot more fortifications that Ukraine can fall back on so that the Russian advance, assuming Pokrovsk falls, is not going to be very rapid. They're just going to run into the very next defensive position. Now, this does kind of line up with what we're seeing, a big push from Putin, a big, really wanting to wrap this up and have some sort of political victory here in the near term. We've seen an increase in attacks, not just in Pokrovsk, but to the north near Dobropili and a couple other areas along the front that generally have not seen large Russian attacks for quite a while. And you can see how this is being framed by Russia, where Putin just yesterday said, quote, "I discussed with the commanders of the respective groups a ceasefire in Pokrovsk and other areas." He said they are not against it, not allowing representatives of the media into the enemy encirclement zones, foreign journalists and Ukrainian journalists, so they can enter and see with their own eyes what is happening, be convinced of the condition of the surrounded Ukrainian troops, and so that the political leadership of Ukraine would make appropriate decisions about the fate of their citizens and their servicemen, just as they once did in Azovstal. We are concerned that there are no provocations from the Ukrainian side. We are ready to cease hostilities for a certain period for several hours, 2, 3, 6 hours, so that a group of journalists can enter, see what is happening there, talk to Ukrainian servicemen, and leave. Now, to take that at face value, you have to assume that what Putin is saying is out of deep respect for the Ukrainian soldiers fighting there. He wants to save their lives and wants to make known to the Ukrainian government and the international media that they are truly surrounded. And he wants to give them the opportunity to speak to the world and plead for their lives so they can come out. I'm not certain that's Putin's actual goal here. It's hard-pressed to see 3 years into this war, just a few hours, actually this was before, a massive missile and drone attack on Ukrainian cities all across the country that killed civilians. Hard-pressed that this is the one thing where he's like, yeah, we're going to do all that other stuff, but this time we're going to do everything we can to try to save the lives of Ukrainian soldiers. Not sure I totally buy that, to say the least. Now, the Russian Ministry of Defense did receive this order and seems to be moving forward with it earlier today, saying, quote, "The Russian command is prepared to cease hostilities for 5 to 6 hours in these areas, as well as provide corridors for unrestricted entry and exit for groups of representatives of foreign media, including Ukrainian ones, provided there will be security guarantees for both journalists and Russian military personnel." There's no way that Ukraine is going to agree to this. It's ridiculous. The rationale that Russia is giving is pretty ridiculous. And, the times that there have been temporary ceasefires in the past, it's not worked out well. There were temporary ceasefires right at the start of the war to try to evacuate civilians from Mariupol. Those civilian corridors were struck by Russian munitions. So, and I'm not again, hard to believe Putin is saying that at face value, that the core reason here is to help the Ukrainian soldiers and not to put out some sort of messaging, maybe directed here at the United States, most likely, about the current situation on the ground. And that does line up with a recent U.S. intelligence assessment that was just talked about a couple days in NBC News, where they said a recent U.S. intelligence assessment warned that Vladimir Putin is more determined than ever to carry on the war in Ukraine and prevail on the battlefield, according to a senior U.S. official and a senior congressional official. Facing steep Russian troop losses and economic setbacks at home, he is committed to securing Ukrainian land and expanding his country's footprint to justify the human and financial toll. The White House, in response to this, said, quote, President Trump has been clear that it is time to stop the killing and make a deal to end the war. The United States will continue to advocate for a peaceful resolution to the war, and a permanent peace depends on Russia's willingness to negotiate in good faith. Now, in terms of that Russian negotiating in good faith, haven't really seen any signs of that. In fact, overnight, they launched 705 munitions into Ukraine, 653 drones, and 52 missiles. According to the Ukrainian military, they say they were able to shoot down or suppress 623 of those 705. They're tracking direct hits from 16 missiles and 63 UAVs at 20 different locations. They said debris of drones and missiles that were shot down fell at 19 different locations, possibly causing damage across the country. They did add that 3 Russian missiles were lost location-wise, so they don't think they shot them down. They don't know that they necessarily impacted. That's an interesting one, but it's going to happen when you've got 700 plus munitions flying into your country at once. President Zelensky said, quote, ordinary residential buildings in Zaporizhia were damaged and a dormitory was destroyed. Dozens of casualties are known as a result of the strike, including 5 children. Unfortunately, 2 people died. He says Russia continues its terrorist war against life, and it is important that every such vile attack on civilians returns to Russia with concrete consequences, sanctions, and real pressure. We expect that America, Europe, and the G7 countries will not ignore Moscow's desire to destroy everything. New steps and pressure are needed on the Russian oil and gas industry and finances. Secondary sanctions on those who sponsor this war. Thank you to everyone who works for peace. Now, Russia did put out their own assessment saying the target of these strikes was the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. Russian mill blogger Two Majors says in the Ivano-Frankivsk region, the Russian armed forces attacked 2 energy infrastructure facilities at once, saying that they hit the Burstin thermal power plant and the Kalush combined heat and power plant. In Lviv, they say they hit the Dobrivtir thermal power plant. They hit the Lazatin thermal power plant in Vinnytsia. In Mykolaiv, they said the railway was damaged. And then in Kyiv, they went after a couple of different airfields. So a major notable piece here is just the volume of munitions being utilized. It wasn't very long ago where Russia crossed the 500 in a night, and we thought, my God, that is so many munitions being utilized in one wave of strikes. That quickly became the norm. Then we jumped to 600. Now we're at 700. Russia's capacity to manufacture these munitions has been increasing. They definitely crossed a threshold probably right towards the start of the year, right around January 2025. Hopefully, some of these new sanctions that are now in place, both from the United States as well as our allies in the European Union, will have some impact on Russia's ability to produce these weapon systems, and we will see, at least stagnation and no more growth in these industries. Hopefully, even a bit of a downward trend over time. Fingers crossed. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.